The sound of hooves rolled across the barren desert like a slow drumbeat, echoing off the distant mesas. The setting sun burned low and red behind the rider, painting the sky in streaks of copper and blood. Dust rose behind the horse's hooves, curling in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Every step brought him closer to the town he'd sworn never to see again. His name was Eli Graves, and he was a man who had lived too long with ghosts. He rode with his head low, hat pulled down to shield his eyes from the dying light. His coat was worn and heavy with the dust of 100 miles, the kind of coat that had seen gunfire and rain, and nights spent alone beneath the stars. The horse beneath him was old but steady, a gray mare with ribs faintly showing and eyes that seemed to understand her rider's burden. There was a wooden box tied carefully to Eli's saddlebag, a small plain thing that carried the last pieces of a life long buried. By the time he reached the edge of Dust Creek, twilight had begun to fall. The town looked smaller than he remembered, quieter too. The wind whistled down the empty street, brushing through the weeds that grew between the boards of the old walkway. A dog barked once, then went silent. The saloon sign swung lazily in the wind, the letters so faded they could barely be read. The place felt more like a ghost town than the living one it once was. But Eli wasn't surprised. Time had a way of draining the life out of things, just as it had drained him. He stopped his horse in the middle of Main Street and sat still for a long while, listening. Somewhere, a piano played faintly, an old tune that drifted from the saloon, cracked and weary. A few shadows moved behind the windows of the general store, faces peeking out before quickly disappearing. Word traveled fast in small towns like this. By now, someone would be whispering that Eli Graves had come back. The outlaw, the gunman, the man who'd once spilled blood in the very dust beneath his boots. He dismounted slowly, his boots touching the ground with a soft crunch. His legs ached from the long ride, but he paid no mind. He reached into his coat and pulled out the small wooden box, holding it as if it were made of glass. Then he looked toward the church at the far end of town, a small white building with a leaning steeple and cracked windows. That was where he needed to go. That was where he'd finally put the past to rest. As he walked, the few townsfolk who lingered outside moved quietly out of his way. He could feel their eyes on him, heavy with recognition and fear. Once years ago, his name had meant something here. He'd been fast with a gun, proud of it too. He'd made his living by the draw, believing himself untouchable. But pride was a fool's cloak. It never kept a man warm, and it never hid the cold truth of what he'd done. When he reached the churchyard, the evening air had turned cool. The gate creaked as he pushed it open, the sound sharp in the silence. The graves stretched out before him in uneven rows, stones weathered by time and wind. He walked slowly among them until he found the one he'd come for. The name carved into the stone hit him like a hammer to the chest: Clara Whitfield. He knelt beside the grave, setting the box down in the dirt. The flowers that once grew here were long dead, just brittle stems poking from the earth. He brushed the dust from the headstone, his rough fingers tracing the letters as if they could still speak. "Hello, Clara," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "Took me a long time, didn't it?" For a moment he didn't move. The desert wind sighed through the churchyard, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. He remembered her smile, the way her laughter had sounded when the world still felt young. She had been the one person who saw good in him, even when he didn't deserve it. Back then, she'd lived here in Dust Creek, teaching schoolchildren in the little building behind the church. She'd told him once that she believed every man had a choice, that even the worst of them could change if they truly wanted to. He hadn't listened. Instead, he'd chosen the road, the gun, and the emptiness that came with both. He opened the box. Inside lay two things: his revolver and a faded photograph. The gun's metal was dull, the wood handle worn smooth from years of use. It had taken more lives than he could count, each one carved into his conscience. The photograph was yellowed with age, edges curled. It showed Clara standing in front of the schoolhouse, sunlight in her hair and that same patient smile on her lips. He stared at the picture for a long time before whispering, "I should have stayed." He dug a shallow hole beside her grave, meaning to bury the box there, his last offering, his final surrender. But just as he began to lower it into the earth, something caught his eye. Beside Clara's headstone, the ground was freshly turned. The soil was dark, loose, too new to belong in this forgotten place. He frowned, his instincts prickling. Someone had been buried here not long ago. There was no name carved into the marker yet, just a wooden stake driven into the ground. He looked around for the caretaker's shed and saw a lantern glowing faintly inside. Maybe old Tom was still alive, the man who used to tend these graves when Eli was young. He picked up the box and started toward the shack. But before he could take more than a few steps, a voice stopped him cold. "Mister, are you Eli Graves?" He turned slowly. A boy stood at the edge of the churchyard, half hidden by the fence. He couldn't have been more than 12. Dust clung to his clothes and his boots looked 2 sizes too big. But what struck Eli most were the boy's eyes, clear, bright, and impossibly familiar. Eyes he had seen once before, long ago, in a woman who'd believed in him. Eli's breath caught. He swallowed hard, his voice rough. "Who's asking?" The boy hesitated, shifting his weight. "My ma told me if I ever saw you, I should tell you something." Eli's stomach turned. "What's that?" "She said to tell you. She forgave you." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the wind through the grass and the faint creak of the church sign swinging overhead. Eli felt the ground tilt beneath him. The box slipped from his hands and hit the dirt. "What did you say?" he asked quietly, stepping closer. The boy looked down at his boots, then back up. "She said you were a good man once. She said maybe you could be again." Eli's voice was barely a whisper. "Your ma, who was she?" The boy's lips pressed together before he answered. "Her name was Clara Whitfield. My name's Caleb." Eli stared at him, the world spinning. The breath went out of his lungs as though he'd been punched. He dropped to one knee, unable to find words. Clara had been gone for nearly 12 years. If the boy was 12, he managed to choke out, "You're her boy?" Caleb nodded. "Grandma Ruth takes care of me now. She says Ma never stopped believing you'd come back someday. Said maybe you just got lost." Eli's vision blurred as he looked at the child. The hair the color of wheat, the stubborn chin, the eyes that carried both softness and fire. He looked so much like her it hurt to breathe. All the years of running, of trying to bury what he'd done, seemed to collapse into this one moment. He wanted to speak, to explain, to say something that might make sense of it all. But the words refused to come. He reached out slowly, afraid the boy would flinch, but Caleb didn't move. He just looked at Eli with that same quiet curiosity, as if trying to understand what kind of man stood before him. Finally, Eli said, "I didn't know, son." "I swear I didn't know," the boy nodded, small and solemn. "Grandma said you didn't. She said people can do bad things and still be sorry after." Eli tried to smile, but it broke halfway. "Your grandma sounds like a wise woman. She says I should stay away from men with guns," Caleb added, glancing at the revolver still lying in the dirt. "But you don't look bad. You look sad." Eli swallowed hard. "Maybe I'm both." The boy tilted his head. "Are you going to stay in Dust Creek now?" Eli looked toward the graves again, his eyes resting on Clara's stone. "I don't know," he said softly. "I came here to bury something." Caleb stepped closer, curiosity flickering across his face. "What's in the box?" "Things that don't belong to me anymore," Eli said. "Things that hurt people." The boy nodded, though he didn't seem to understand. "Grandma says we all got things like that." Eli gave a faint laugh that sounded more like a sigh. "She's right about that." The sky above them had turned deep blue, the first stars appearing. Crickets had begun their nightly chorus. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The moment hung there between them. Strange, fragile, and full of something Eli hadn't felt in years. Hope. Caleb shuffled his boots, then said quietly, "Grandma's probably waiting for me. You could come by if you want." "We live by the old mill road," Eli hesitated. He wanted to run, because that was what he'd always done when life got too real. But this time his feet wouldn't move. He looked down at the grave once more, then back at the boy. "Maybe I will," he said softly. Caleb smiled, a small, hesitant smile that caught the dying light. "She'll be mad at first, but I think she'll be glad too." Eli nodded slowly. Tell her I ain't the same man I used to be. The boy shrugged. She says no one ever is. When Caleb turned and ran down the dirt path toward town, Eli stood there alone in the growing dark. He looked at Clara's grave, the fresh mound beside it, and the wooden box at his feet. For a long time he didn't move. The wind lifted the edges of the photograph lying half buried in the dust, and Eli knelt to pick it up again. He looked at Clara's face, her eyes, her smile, and then at the fading trail where the boy had disappeared. He felt something stir deep inside him, something that had been buried far longer than his gun ever would be. He closed the box gently, then whispered, I reckon it's time I start doing right by you. The church bell rang in the distance, slow and solemn, marking the hour. Eli lifted the box again, but he didn't bury it. Not yet. He turned back toward his horse, the photograph still in his hand, and watched the stars bloom over Dust Creek. For the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. He'd come here to bury his past, but instead, he'd found the reason to face it. Night settled over Dust Creek like a soft blanket, the kind that hid more than it revealed. The small town was quiet now, its lamps flickering weakly against the cold desert wind. Eli sat on the porch of a small cabin on the edge of town, his hat resting on his knee, eyes fixed on the horizon where the last streaks of orange had just disappeared. The mare grazed lazily nearby, too tired to care about the dust that blew across the ground. The air smelled of smoke and dry earth, and the only sound was the steady creak of the rocking chair beside him. Inside the cabin, he could hear the faint clatter of dishes and a woman's low voice. Ruth Whitfield, Clara's sister. The years had aged her, but hadn't hardened her. When she'd first opened the door and seen him standing there, she'd gone pale, nearly dropped the oil lamp in her hand. He could still hear her voice his head sharp and trembling with disbelief. You've got a lot of nerve coming back here, Eli Graves. He hadn't argued. He didn't have the right. Now she stood inside that small cabin, moving around with a kind of tired grace, her gray hair tied back and her hands busy, because if they stopped moving, they might start shaking. Through the open window, he caught a glimpse of her setting supper on the table. 3 plates, though only 2 of them were used often. The door creaked open, and Caleb stepped out, holding a tin cup of water in his hands. The boy sat on the steps beside Eli, kicking at the wood with his boots. You sure don't talk much, Caleb said after a moment, looking up at him. Eli smiled faintly. Don't have much to say, son. You got a lot of stories, though, don't you? Grandma said you used to be a cowboy. Something like that, Eli said, though the truth was closer to a killer than a cowboy. You like cowboys? The boy shrugged. Depends what kind. Some of them are mean. Some are heroes. You one of the good ones? Eli didn't answer. The boy waited, then added, Grandma said you were trouble once. Said my ma loved you anyway. That hit deeper than any bullet. Eli took a slow breath, his throat tightening. Your ma had a way of seeing light where there wasn't any. Caleb frowned. You mean like how she believed people could change? Eli nodded. Exactly like that. They sat in silence for a while. Crickets chirped in the grass, and the wind rustled through the mesquite trees. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried, lonely and distant. Eli's hands rested on his knees, and for a long time he didn't move, afraid that if he did, he might lose the strange peace that had settled between them. After a few minutes, Ruth stepped outside, drying her hands on her apron. Her eyes, sharp and blue as winter ice, studied Eli for a long moment before she spoke. You plan on staying out there all night? Eli rose to his feet slowly. Didn't figure I was welcome inside. You're not, she said flatly, but Caleb's got questions, and I ain't about to have him thinking the world's nothing but lies. Eli nodded, tipping his hat slightly. Appreciate that. Don't thank me, she said. I ain't doing it for you." Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled faintly of stew. The table was set simply, wooden bowls and spoons, the kind of humble life Eli had never been able to give Clara. He sat across from Caleb, who watched him with quiet fascination, and Ruth, who never took her eyes off him. Every spoonful of stew felt like a test he was failing. Finally, Ruth said, "You look tired." "I've been riding a long time," Eli replied. "Still running?" she asked. He looked down at his bowl, trying not to. Her expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. "You can't just ride back in here and expect to find forgiveness waiting for you." "I didn't come for that," he said. "Didn't even know there was something left to forgive." "You didn't know you had a son?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. Eli shook his head slowly. "No, Clara never told me. By the time I heard she passed, I was too far gone to come back. Couldn't have faced her folks. Couldn't have faced you." Ruth's eyes glistened in the firelight. "You think that excuses you?" "No, ma'am," he said softly. "There ain't an excuse big enough to carry what I did." Caleb looked between them, confused but listening carefully. Ruth caught his gaze and sighed. "Go on and wash up, Caleb. Get ready for bed." When the boy disappeared into the next room, she leaned across the table, her voice low and steady. "That child's got Clara's heart, you know. He believes people are good. He believes the world will give him what it took from her. I won't let you ruin that." Eli met her gaze. "I don't aim to. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." "Then you leave," Ruth said coldly. "You bury your box, you bury your past, and you keep riding till the dust swallows you. That's the best thing you can do for him." He wanted to agree. It would have been easier to walk away, to keep drifting like he always had. But something deep inside him resisted. Something that had woken the moment he saw Caleb's face. "He deserves to know who I am," Eli said quietly. "Even if he hates me for it." Ruth shook her head. "He deserves peace. Don't take that from him." He stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. "Maybe peace ain't about forgetting. Maybe it's about facing what's been left behind." She didn't answer. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the faint chirping of night insects outside. Eli put his hat back on and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, he said, "If it means anything, I never stopped thinking about her." Ruth's voice softened, almost breaking. "Then you should have come back sooner." The night air hit him like a wave of cold truth. He sat on the porch again, looking up at the stars, each one sharp and distant. The desert was quiet, but not peaceful. There was too much weight in the silence, too many things left unsaid. He stayed there long after the lights inside went out. The moon climbed high, casting silver light across the land. Every creak of the windmill, every distant coyote call seemed to echo the same thought. You can't outrun what you owe. When morning came, he saddled the horse but didn't leave. Instead, he found himself walking toward the small corral behind the cabin. Caleb was already there, trying clumsily to fasten a saddle on a young mule. "You're up early," Eli said. "Grandma says chores don't wait for the sun," Caleb replied, grinning. "You gonna help?" Eli chuckled softly and stepped closer, showing the boy how to tighten the cinch properly. "You do it like this, see? Not too loose, not too tight." Caleb nodded, watching closely. "You used to ride a lot, huh?" "More than I should have," Eli said. "Spent half my life staring at a trail that didn't lead anywhere." "Why?" Eli hesitated. "Because sometimes a man don't realize he's lost until there's nothing left to find." Caleb frowned, not quite understanding, but he kept listening. "You ever shoot anyone?" Eli froze. The air went still for a moment. Yeah, he said finally. Too many. Caleb was quiet, thinking. Grandma says killing's the worst thing a man can do. She's right, Eli said. But she probably also told you sometimes people do the wrong thing for what they think's the right reason. Doesn't make it right. It just makes it sad. The boy looked down, nodding slowly. Did you kill for the wrong reason? Eli's eyes clouded. I killed because I didn't know how to stop. They worked in silence for a while after that. The sun climbed higher, turning the sand to gold. Ruth came out to hang laundry, watching them both from a distance. There was still distrust in her eyes, but something else too, maybe the faintest flicker of mercy. At noon, Eli walked Caleb to the schoolhouse. The building was small, white paint peeling, just like the one Clara used to teach in. The children gathered at the steps stared at him curiously. He felt out of place, like a ghost walking through someone else's life. When he left Caleb with his classmates, he found himself drawn back to the churchyard. He stood again before Clara's grave, the wind tugging gently at his coat. You had a son, he said quietly. And I didn't even know. You must have hated me for leaving. But you still told him to forgive me. He knelt and brushed dust from the stone. You were always the brave one, Clara. Maybe now it's my turn to try. By the time he returned to the cabin, Ruth was waiting on the porch. You went to see her again, she said. Had to, Eli replied. You think she answers you? Maybe not in words, he said. But I reckon I hear her anyway. Ruth looked at him for a long time before speaking. He likes you, you know that? Eli nodded slowly. I can see it. That scares me, she admitted. He's been through enough loss. Don't give him hope if you're gonna ride off again. He met her gaze. I ain't going anywhere, not yet. She crossed her arms. Then what are you planning to do? Learn how to be his father, Eli said simply. If he'll let me. Ruth sighed, her eyes softening against her will. You don't make things easy, do you, Eli Graves? He smiled faintly. Never did. For the first time since his arrival, Ruth smiled back. A tired, reluctant smile, but real. She turned toward the door. Come in then. I got coffee. That evening, as the sun fell behind the hills, Eli sat with Caleb outside, showing him how to saddle a real horse this time. The boy's laughter echoed through the fading light, and for a moment, it almost felt like peace. Ruth watched from the window, her expression unreadable but gentler than before. When darkness came, Eli sat alone again, looking out at the stars. Caleb had gone to bed, but his voice still lingered in Eli's head. Maybe men like you just never tried, he whispered into the night. Maybe this time I will. But even as he said it, a chill crept through the air. He could feel something coming, the way a man feels the storm before the sky breaks. The quiet of Dust Creek wasn't natural. It was the kind that waited before chaos. He didn't know yet that the ghosts he'd buried were on their way back, wearing the faces of men who once called him brother. For now, though, he sat beneath the stars, a tired man learning what it meant to stay still, and for the first time in years, he felt something that might have been called peace, if only for a while. The morning came hard and bright, the kind of morning that didn't wait for a man to be ready for it. The desert sun rose over Dust Creek like a slow-burning fuse, lighting every cracked board, every piece of forgotten metal, every scar the town had ever worn. Eli stood outside the cabin, the air already dry in his throat, his shoulder aching from old wounds that still remembered the shape of bullets. He could smell coffee and dust and hear the creak of the windmill turning in lazy rhythm. For the first time in years, he'd slept through the night without waking to the sound of gunfire in his dreams. But peace, he knew, never lasted long for men like him. Caleb came running out of the cabin, boots half-tied, grinning in that wild, unguarded way only children could. "Pa, You said you'd teach me how to shoot today, he said eagerly, the words spilling out before Eli could answer. It still startled him. Pa. He didn't know when the boy had started calling him that. Maybe sometime after the second evening, they'd spent together fixing the corral fence. It was a small word, but to Eli it carried more weight than any he'd ever known. He crouched down, smiling faintly. Ain't much good comes from learning to shoot, son. But learning when not to, now that's something worth knowing. Caleb tilted his head. You mean like a test? More like a choice, Eli said, ruffling the boy's hair. And it's the hardest one a man'll ever have to make. Ruth stepped out onto the porch, her apron still dusted with flour. You shouldn't be teaching that boy anything about guns, she said firmly. The world's already full of men who think shooting is the same as living. Eli nodded, his tone quiet. You're right. I just figure if trouble ever comes knocking, better he knows what it looks like. Ruth sighed, looking past him toward the horizon. Let's hope it don't come knocking today. But by noon, the horizon had already begun to change. The heat shimmered above the road leading into Dust Creek, twisting the air like smoke. From the edge of town came the sound of hooves, slow at first, then faster, then many. The people of Dust Creek, what few of them there were, began to peer out from behind doors and shutters. The sound wasn't ordinary traffic. It was a group ride, the kind that carried dust and danger in equal measure. Eli felt it before he saw it. A chill ran down his spine, the kind that comes when a man's past starts catching up to his shadow. He looked toward the road, squinting through the glare. There were 6 of them, maybe 7, riding hard and straight through the center of town. The man in front rode tall in the saddle, his coat black as tar, his grin sharp enough to cut. Mason Hale, Eli's stomach turned. Mason had been his partner once, brother even, back in the days when bullets and blood had been their language. Together they'd robbed stages, chased bounties, fought over whiskey and women, and buried too many dead men in shallow graves. But Mason had gone darker than Eli ever dared. And when Eli finally walked away, Mason had sworn he'd never let him rest. Eli turned toward Ruth, his voice tight. Get Caleb inside, now. Ruth saw the look in his eyes and didn't argue. She grabbed the boy by the arm, her voice steady but sharp. Inside, Caleb, don't argue me. What's wrong? The boy asked, his brow furrowing. Just do as I say, she snapped, pushing him through the door. Eli stepped into the street, his boots sinking slightly into the soft dust. Mason and his men had already dismounted, the horses snorting and restless. Mason's grin widened when he saw him. Well, I'll be damned, Mason drawled, his voice smooth as snake oil. Eli Graves, the ghost of the Badlands. Didn't think you had the guts to come crawling back here. Eli stood his ground, his coat flapping slightly in the wind. Ain't crawlin', just came to bury what's left. Mason laughed, throwing his head back. You buried? You couldn't bury your own sins if the whole desert helped you dig. You always did have a habit of leaving things unfinished. His eyes flicked toward the cabin. Heard a whisper you got yourself a family out here. That true? Eli's hand hovered near his holster, though he hadn't drawn yet. You best keep their names out of your mouth, Mason. Now, Mason said, raising his hands mockingly. Just making conversation. Don't see you as the fatherly type, though. You sure that boy's yours? He don't look like a killer. He's better than you and me put together, Eli said quietly. That's what scares you, ain't it? The men behind Mason chuckled darkly, fingering their weapons. Mason stepped closer, boots crunching in the dirt. You still owe me, Eli. You remember that last job? The one that went south outside Yuma? You left me there bleeding in the dust while you rode off with the gold and the law at your heels. Eli's jaw tightened. That gold never made it to me, Mason. The law took it, and I lost everything else worth keeping. I don't owe you a damn thing. Oh, I think you do, Mason said. And if it ain't gold, I'll take something else instead. Maybe that fine little house. Or maybe... He looked toward the cabin again and his grin turned cold. Maybe the boy. Eli's blood went ice cold. You touch him and I swear you'll what? Mason cut in, smirking. You gonna shoot me down in front of the good people of Dust Creek? After all that talk about burying your past? Looks to me like it's digging itself right back up. Eli could feel the eyes of the townsfolk peering from windows, the air heavy with silence. He spoke low. "Leave now, Mason. You can still ride out of here." Mason spat into the dust. "You ain't the one giving orders anymore." He drew his gun faster than most men could blink. But Eli wasn't most men. The years hadn't stolen his reflex. In one smooth motion, Eli's revolver cleared the holster and barked once, a sharp crack that split the air. Mason's hat flew off his head, the bullet grazing close enough to shave a lock of hair. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then the street exploded with gunfire. Eli dove behind a trough, the splintered wood flying around him. The town erupted into chaos. Ruth screamed from inside the cabin. Caleb cried out her name. Eli reloaded by instinct, the old rhythm returning like a heartbeat he'd tried to forget. He fired again, dropping one of Mason's men before rolling to cover behind a wagon. Bullets kicked up dust inches from his boots. "Still quick, ain't you?" Mason called out, laughter in his voice. "But you can't win, Graves. There's too many of us." Eli gritted his teeth. "Then I reckon I better be faster." He stepped out from cover, firing twice before they could react. 2 more men fell and the rest ducked for shelter. But Mason was clever. He didn't fight fair. He circled around, moving toward the cabin. Eli saw him too late. Mason kicked open the door, grabbing Ruth by the arm. "You think you can play house, Eli?" he shouted. "This is what comes of trying to live clean." Eli's stomach dropped. "Let her go." "Or what?" Mason sneered, pressing the barrel of his revolver against her temple. "You shoot, she dies. You don't shoot, I take her and the boy. Either way, you lose." Eli's hand trembled, his breath coming in short bursts. His mind raced. Then from the corner of his eye he saw movement. Small, quiet, but sure. Caleb, crouched behind the cabin wall, holding the rifle Eli had taught him to clean just yesterday. The boy's hands shook, but his eyes were steady. Eli locked eyes with him for a heartbeat. No words were needed. Mason shifted slightly, his attention fixed on Eli. "You should have stayed dead, old friend." Before he could pull the trigger, a sharp crack split the air. Mason's head jerked back, the bullet tearing through his hat and knocking him to the ground. His gun fired wild into the dirt as he fell, eyes wide with shock. The echo of the shot rolled through the valley, fading slow as thunder. Eli froze. His gaze shot to the cabin. Caleb stood there, rifle still smoking in his small hands, face pale as snow, tears streaming down his cheeks. Ruth stumbled free, clutching her chest. "Oh Lord!" Eli ran forward, grabbing the rifle before it dropped. He knelt beside the boy, pulling him close. "It's over, son. It's over," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to stop him." Eli pressed a hand to the back of his head, holding him tight. "You did what you had to, Caleb. You saved your grandma. You saved me." The street was silent now, save for the wind. Mason lay still in the dirt, eyes open to the sky. The other outlaws had fled, their courage leaving as quickly as it had come. The townsfolk began to emerge, one by one, cautious but curious. Ruth knelt beside Mason's body, her face drawn. She looked at Eli. That boy just took a life. Eli met her gaze, grief heavy in his eyes. "And I'll carry it for him every day I've got left." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe there's hope for you after all." They buried Mason outside the churchyard the next morning. No words were spoken. Eli dug the grave himself, each shovel of dirt a penance he didn't expect to end. When it was done, he took the small wooden box, the same one he'd once meant to bury with Clara, and placed it beside the grave. Inside was his revolver, the symbol of every mistake he'd ever made. He covered it with earth and pressed a hand to the mound. "Here lies the past," he said quietly. Caleb stood beside him, holding Ruth's hand. His face was pale, older somehow, but his eyes were clear. "What do we do now?" he asked softly. Eli looked toward the rising sun. "We live," he said. "That's what your ma would have wanted." Weeks passed, and Dust Creek began to heal. The saloon reopened, the laughter slowly returned, and the whispers of Eli Graves' redemption spread like wildfire across the plains. He worked the land with Ruth and Caleb, rebuilt fences, fixed the roof, and learned how to live without a gun on his hip. At night, he would sit on the porch and tell Caleb stories, not of outlaws or gunfights, but of redemption, of second chances, of finding peace after years of war, and sometimes, when the wind blew just right. He could almost swear he heard Clara's voice in it, soft and forgiving, telling him he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all along. He'd ridden into town to bury his past, but what he found instead was a reason to stay, a family he never knew he had, and a future that no bullet could ever take away.